Cool. I think we have a big enough, a big enough critical mass to start. We've got about 51 people on the call. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. It's a webinar titled Returns to a Broader Base, and we'll be taking a look at forms of mandated ownership looking at these within the framework of a broad-based Black economic empowerment, trusts, broad-based ownership structures, employee share ownership schemes, and many other schemes of that kind that effectively want to give expression to the responsibility of the broad-based Black economic empowerment program to be as broad as possible in terms of the base of people who benefit from participating. I think that's certainly been one of the early criticisms of earlier phases of broad-based Black economic empowerment, that it empowered only a few who are quite close to those in political power, but also effectively it was solely focused on what is happening in critical sectors in the listed space, in the mining sector, the financial services sector, and many of the sectors reliant on state procurement and the issue of licenses by the state. And so I take this opportunity to welcome you all. I'm the facilitator this afternoon. I'm a research associate at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. And also, have the pleasure of being able to facilitate what we certainly hope is going to be a fascinating conversation. I have three guests who are going to help us in this discussion, and one is the Commissioner of the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Commission, Zodwa Ntuli, who joins us. Kwezilomso Mabasa is a senior researcher at Mistra's Faculty of Political Economy, and Ibrahim Khalil Hassan is an independent public policy analyst and also the founder of Zapreneur. And I'll say a bit more just before they start about their background, some of their experience in this arena. But it's also a really great pleasure to see the diversity of people who have joined the session. We're now on about 67. I'm seeing, people from the presidency, people from the labor movement, practitioners within industry, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all. Just briefly, before we start, some housekeeping on my end. Everybody as they join is on mute. So we do that because we don't want a situation where you are busy, making your preparations for dinner, and we get to hear you chopping up all manner of other things because you're not on mute. We will, of course, give an opportunity for people to interact in two ways. One is the chat function, and we certainly encourage all of us to engage as robustly as we can in the chat. But also, we will, as we open the Q&A in the latter parts of our conversation, allow people who've raised their hand, who want to make an input, who might have clarity-seeking questions, or even want to share some of the experiences. We'll then make that opportunity open for people to do so. So please feel free as we, in the lead up to the Q&A, and I'll certainly flag that, to just raise your hand so that we can take stock of some of the hands that we have. And then we'll take it from there. So I think in terms of where we are, I think we're all clear about the context of our discussion. We really want to make sense today of many of the mandated ownership structures, which have certainly, attracted a lot of attention and scrutiny of late. A lot of questions around fulfilling and meeting ownership tests. And I know the Commissioner will speak to some of this, but also, widening the aperture of what we understand transformation to be, beyond just a very technicist attention to compliance, but also really dedicating ourselves to a much broader conception of broad-based Black economic empowerment that is able to grapple with the political economy of South Africa, that is also able to really deal and be in conversation with the market structure of our society, all structural and macro features which are no doubt critical to the success in broad-based Black economic empowerment. We also want to make, some sense of, the variance that we've seen in outcomes and experiences from the different trusts across different sectors or the different structures of mandated ownership that we've seen. and what might account for that variance? What might account for the differences in outcomes that we see within sectors, across sectors, and I guess one would say across our entire economy as well. So I guess with that said, let me take this opportunity to kick things off. And our first speaker is going to be Kwezilom Somabasa, as I said. He's a senior researcher in political economy at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, and quite recently worked on a publication that came out of MISTRA, which he co-edited alongside myself, which was looking at some of the critical debates that we will certainly be paying some attention to this afternoon. And he has a background in the labor movement. He's currently undertaking a PhD in development sociology at WITS, and certainly somebody whose intellectual interests are in the world of heterodox political economy, political sociology, and political philosophy. Kwezi, the platform is yours, my brother.
Thank you, Program Director, the leadership for the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, the Triple B Commissioner, fellow panelists, comrades, friends, guests, all protocol observed. The public policy debate on BEE and Black entrepreneurship in post-apartheid South Africa has been reduced to three main approaches. Firstly, an emphasis on what Ponta and Old describe as the managerialization of BEE, the treatment of BEE as a separate technical entity to be managed according to the principles of corporate social responsibility and auditing. This paradigm mainly focuses on the Triple B Act, the codes of good practice, and regulatory compliance. The second approach focuses on share transfers, ownership demographics, governance, and dividend accumulation in large-scale BEE transactions completed since 1994, especially those that occurred between 2000 and 2010. This literature examines the experiences and market activity of BEE pioneer companies, which are popularly referred to as the Fab Four: Mvela Panda, Shanduka, Safika Holdings, and African Rainbow. A third approach dissects class formation debates on creating an independent Black capitalist class, which uses economic rents for productive economic activity instead of rent-seeking or neo-patrimonialism. The emphasis here is on the politics of transformation, corruption, and so-called tenderpreneurs. This last strand has unfortunately captured the public discourse, especially in light of the evidence provided in the various state capture analyses. It is widely accepted that BEE generally and Triple BEE policy framework specifically are faced with a serious legitimacy crisis. In February 2020, the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection published a book entitled Beyond Tenderpreneurship, Rethinking Black Business and Economic Empowerment. This publication, edited by myself and Ayabonga Tawe, examined what underlies the Triple BEE policy framework legitimacy crisis by exploring two fundamental questions. What is the socio-economic impact of BEE, and what lessons can be drawn from varied Black entrepreneur experiences, and relying not only on just documented analysis, but actually interviews. The main aim of this publication was to contribute to BEE policy reform debates through a different, or what I call a fourth approach, an approach which embeds Triple BEE in broader political economy debates on post-apartheid economic restructuring. This type of analysis departs from the three approaches described in my introductory remarks in several ways. It shifts our discourse from a limited focus on shareholding transfers, demographic ownership trends, good governance, and shared dividend accumulation. We can only achieve returns to a broader base of beneficiaries through ESOPs, trusts, or broad-based ownership structures if we adopt a policy approach that locates Triple BEE in economy-wide impacts, restructuring South Africa's industrial base and wider conceptions of social redistribution. In other words, I am arguing that establishing or reforming broad-based ownership structures without considering altering market configurations, sector configurations, and investment patterns will not produce the entire socioeconomic outcomes. I'm not totally dismissing the need for transforming operational control or demographic ownership in different BBOs or any other entity involved in a BE transaction. But it is important to highlight that these two factors are not sufficient for guaranteeing returns to a broader base. I'm positing an alternative view articulated in Mistra's publication, which calls for achieving returns to a broader base through the following core arguments. Firstly, creating a conducive macroeconomic environment for achieving the wider socio-economic impacts in triple BE policy implementation. Evidence suggests that fiscal, monetary, competition, and industrial policy frameworks shape the success and failures of triple BE transactions. More importantly, they determine the nature and depth of returns to parties involved in empowerment deals. We need to ensure that the decisions taken in these key policy areas complement achieving a broader triple BE beneficiary base. This necessitates centering BE impacts when considering major policy reforms. For example, most empowerment transactions are financed through third-party debts, and the costs of servicing this debt are determined by monetary policy. Therefore, debates on appropriate monetary policy frameworks have a significant impact on BE transaction outcomes. Similarly, competition policy and market access determine pricing amongst different entrepreneurs. Now, we all know that Black entrepreneurs often fail the competitive market pricing tests. And this trend is mistakenly reduced to price collusion led by corrupt middlemen. But this perspective misses the point that pricing options are largely influenced by market access and scale. Competition policy also shapes triple BE market activity through regulating mergers and acquisitions, as seen in the much lauded Coca-Cola deal with a 15% worker ownership stake and increases in supplies from Black sugarcane farmers. There are additional examples in the fiscal and industrial policy areas which illustrate how macroeconomic policy choices shape triple BE success or failures. The second argument, core argument from the publication, relates to broadening our understanding of Black enterprise development and market transformation. South Africa's empowerment policy is primarily aimed at advancing share transfers and demographic ownership changes within the JSE listed companies. I accept this rationale given the JSE centrality in South Africa's economy. But we must equally think about Black economic empowerment and enterprise development outside the listed market space. Most formal, fully owned Black enterprises, which mostly fall within the SMME classification, are not listed companies. Research indicates that they are confronted with structural political economy barriers. These include, but are not limited to, access to markets, finance, technological upgrading, and regulatory constraints. In addition, the triple BE policy frameworks have overlooked the informal economy. This is astonishing because demographic data indicates that Black African entrepreneurs are leading informal economic activity. Triple BE policy interventions have largely treated Black entrepreneurs as a monolithic social group without due consideration for differences in enterprise size, access to capital, sector participation, and business strategies. Returns to a broader base require looking within and beyond the JSE listed space and a comprehensive Black enterprise support strategy for non-listed economic activity. This includes, in our view, a dedicated focus on the informal economy. The calibrated transformation approach is more suitable for addressing other intersectional inequalities such as race, gender, and urban and rural divides. The third argument, or the third key lesson from the book, relates about thinking about BEE beyond the confines of what Ashman and Mohammed describe as the traditional finance-led minerals and energy complex. We cannot broaden returns or ownership within the confines of existing market structures. Research on the major empowerment transactions concluded between the early and late 2000s indicates that they occurred in three main sectors: mining, finance, and energy. The limited socioeconomic impacts and minimal market structure changes of these large-scale transactions is documented in several BEE publications, particularly the work of Jenny Cargill and Duma Tubule. Achieving returns to a broader base requires thinking about Black entrepreneurship and empowerment through an industrial diversification, market structure reform, and technological upgrading lens. One example of this is the renewable energy sector, which is still in its early product and innovation life cycle. Another example is the ongoing debate on digitization and its impact on services sectors like transport within the context of platform economy business models. Triple BEE and Black enterprise development can be leveraged to produce greater economy-wide social returns in developing the transitions towards the low carbon and digital economies. Lastly, the design of BEE deals, financial frameworks, and performance indicators needs to be reformulated in order to achieve broad-based participation and economic restructuring. Empowerment transactions must be structured on the basis of and in response to operational and business productivity concerns. These two elements should be prioritized over narrow financial indicators such as share price movements, interest rates, and dividend policies. The case studies in our published book provide concrete examples on how to achieve this aim by highlighting some outlier transactions, especially in the area of ESOPs and trade union investment companies. In these outlier cases, ESOPs and union investments were not limited to dividend payouts, but rather some crucial political economy considerations, such as worker control, industrial diversification, and addressing structural socioeconomic inequalities. This includes building alternative investment patterns and ownership structures within the political economy. We need to think about frameworks for measuring a good empowerment deal or investment that produces greater social returns. This is where I depart from the fixation with the triple BEE codes, which constrain us to a strict quantitative discussion on points and accounting procedures. South Africa needs to reimagine how it examines triple BEE transactions with an emphasis on the deeper structural political economy issues raised in my input. Overall, the discussion on BBO should not be disembedded from these wider political economy factors. The operational control, demographic changes within these structures will produce minimal socioeconomic gains if we separate them from these fundamental economic restructuring imperatives. We must also explore international case studies from Malaysia, USA, the East Asian development states, and India on how to pursue broad-based socioeconomic redress. The evidence from these international case studies suggests that successful policy implementation rests on the macroeconomic policy and political context under which socioeconomic redress is pursued. Another crucial lesson is the ability of states to ensure that rents are used for broadening socioeconomic returns and economic restructuring. Alice Amsterdam refers to these measures as reciprocal control mechanisms, which have been poorly enforced in our BEE policy implementation efforts. The state's role and active participation in markets is equally essential for achieving returns to a broader base. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Kwezi. Thank you very much for that input, and certainly quite a lot there that I'm no doubt sure that many of our participants who now number just shy of 100 will definitely engage and grapple with it. If you joined us as Kwezi was already presenting, Kwezi Mabasa is a senior researcher at MISTRA in the Faculty of Political Economy and also co-editor of the book Beyond Tenderpreneurship, Rethinking Black Business and Economic Empowerment. Now, one of the contributors to that publication is our next speaker. And he is somebody who has extensive experience in the world of research. He's an independent public policy analyst with experience also in research environments in the labor movement, and somebody who has certainly dedicated a lot of time in trying to understand how we can configure these relations to make sure that we broaden the base of economic participants in our economy, as concentrated and closed off as many parts of that economy continue to be. Ibrahim Khalil Hassan is his name, and he is going to give us some inputs based on a piece of work he's done, considering and exploring a broad-based return to workers, many of whom are involved in employee share ownership schemes, and in some cases also through their trade unions involved in all manner of vehicles that are aimed at making investments in key parts of the economy. Now, the big question, of course, is are those investments and even the payoffs from those investments aligned to the political and strategic initiatives of the trade union, to which, of course, many of these vehicles one would think would belong. And those are some of the issues and I guess some of the answers that we certainly hope Ibrahim Khalil will be able to give us. EK, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Ayabonga. I'm going to share my screen. Here you go. So thank you to the South Center for the opportunity to expand on a piece of work that I did together with Mistra in this book. What I'm going to be presenting today is not strictly speaking the chapter itself. I will give a link to the chapter just after I speak, after I conclude speaking. What I'd like to focus on is a couple of developments since writing the chapter. It plays quite strongly into what Kwezi was saying earlier around a political economy approach. So I'm a little bit nervous because it's the first time I'm presenting these ideas, but let's see how it goes. I hope you guys will enjoy it. And I hope I can get done within 15 minutes. So this is what I want to do, is I want to do some work on the overall conceptual issues and the overall outcomes in the economy, then to focus around ASOPs and trade union investment companies, and then to link into the question of options. So when we speak about inequality, what we're really speaking about is this black box called distribution, right? And our discussion in South Africa focuses very much on issues of redistribution, right? So basically, the distribution of something in a different way, typically to achieve greater social equality. However, in engaging with the concepts, I mean, there's also this concept called pre-distribution, which is the idea that the state should try to prevent inequalities occurring in the first place, rather than ameliorating them via tax and benefits once they have occurred, as occurs under redistribution. So the idea is that one begins to configure market relationships in a way that leads to a more equitable outcome. So if you can just look on top, the distribution issue is a big issue. It's a black box. I mean, there's issues around capitalism. It's the choices of people within the system, historical legacy of colonialism, continuities with the past, causalities in terms of macroeconomic policies, and there's the complexities of race and gender. However, in this presentation, what I want to really focus on is around these questions around what I'm calling pre-distribution. So the genealogy of the term is actually comes from a guy called Jacob Heck, which is a cool name, Jacob Heck. But yeah, I mean, he basically argues, in this case, dealing with questions of the middle class housing for Americans, is that people have almost an entitlement to certain endowments within the economy, and that public policy should be focused on achieving them. So we're going to focus quite squarely around questions of pre-distribution. I have a few slides to go through. I'm going to slow down, and um, I can meet the 15 minutes I've been given. So when we speak about pre-distribution, I just want to highlight kind of three sort of big issues. This distribution black box. The first one is that we have a very, very concentrated economy. So we call it oligopoly, etc. What this table, it's from Stats SA. It basically looks at the concentration levels in the manufacturing sector. So at a subsector level. So basically what you can see is that in a number of sectors, we are extremely concentrated. So the data here is the percentage share of the top 10 largest companies. For instance, I mean, if you look at food production, we might say that 39.7 in year 2008. We might think that that's low. But actually, in comparison to other countries, that would actually be quite a high level of ownership by a few companies. Laid on top of that is this question of unemployment, and this actually comes from some work I'm doing together with Ayabonga and other colleagues. And this basically just looks at the official and the expanded unemployment rate. So very, very big increase in unemployment from 2008 that we're beginning to deal with. Also longer term unemployment. People are employed for much longer. Unemployed for much longer. And then there's the issue around state capture. What has actually happened within the state? And two cartoons are both from the awesome Brandon Reynolds. The one is the McKinsey and Company when they agreed to pay some monies back to the state. And then this issue around that is not just one issue around the Guptas. I mean, it's a widespread phenomenon across the state. So we have the Bosasa case being mentioned here, but across we have this issue of rent seeking across the economy in a very decentralized way. So at the broadest level, our attempts at pre-distribution, it's just not happening. And we can speak about the structure of production. I've spoken a bit about unemployment, but it's important to know that it's young, African, it's female, it's rural. And basically what we're having is increasing levels of polarization within our society. It's also the starting point, and this is why when we speak about distribution and pre-distribution is so important. Whatever interventions we undertake are rooted within a type of capitalism that really does not support a broad-based outcome. So if you have high levels of concentration and many people excluded from the economy, whatever you do in terms of policy is not going to have a bigger impact. It requires a question. I mean, it raises a whole range of questions, and I know what a lot of people are thinking in the meeting, that this might be a self-evident conclusion. However, I ask you to consider two things. Consider how Treasury responds to this set of circumstances by seeking to increase investment and deal with efficiencies, and project that over a 10-year period and ask, are we going to be in a better position? Also, consider the proposals from radical economic transformation aimed at land reform, when we know that, or it's alleged that many of the people advocating for radical economic transformation are rent seekers. Are outcomes going to be better under either of them? I'm doubtful of both sorts of approaches. And in fact, I mean, if you want to do the third one, would be to connect the dots between sort of a treasuries approach and an RET approach, which is another issue, maybe for another day. So can we begin to design better pre-distribution systems? And I'm going to look specifically around trade union investment companies and ESOPs based on the book. So some high-level sort of outcomes. Some of these investment companies for trade unions are quite big. NUM, NUMSA, SAPAU, SACTU, which is through HCI, Hoskins Consolidated. These are fairly big companies. They're above 3 billion rand in terms of our estimate. A bit difficult to come to estimates because the books are not completely open across trade unions. But are they an alternative to oligopolistic capitalism? We'll deal with that in the next couple of slides. And so to deal with this is that conceptually it was important to begin to pin this thing down, and we developed this concept called return to workers, which we counterpose to return on investment, or ROI. And it basically consists of two things. On the one axis, we're asking whether an investment is profitable, because that's critical that it be profitable for there to be some return to workers. And on the other end, on the other one, whether the returns to workers are positive or negative, right? I'm just going to go through some of the high level findings of this year. So TUIC, another acronym, is Trade Union Investment Companies, are basically cited as a reason for trade union implosion. And yeah, I mean, it's the proverbial hornet's nest. I mean, whether one looks at SAPAU, SAMU, FAU, POPCRU, or even as I was reminded earlier by Abonga, the transport union, there's big issues in each of them emanating from the trade union investment company. And in some cases, it's rendered the unions almost dysfunctional. Actually, they are dysfunctional. And the experience suggests some sort of capture of unions. So it's a long-running thing over many years. The third point is that it's difficult to understand the storyline because it's so contested even within the trade union. So, for instance, in SEPAO, we have a much clearer understanding of what's going on because a lot of these issues have gone to court. The second issue is an alternative to capitalism. Large numbers of the investments occur in not only the non-productive sectors, but in sectors you wouldn't consider unions to be investing in. So one would be finance, and the idea being that you would establish a financing company and in a sense you would sell financial products to your members, which I think creates a conflict of interest. But nonetheless, I mean, in the context of a union criticism that one of the challenges that we have in our economy is the financialization of the economy, it raises question. And the other one is a more of an ethical one, but the unions are highly invested in the gambling sector. So it's not only those. I mean, they have some investments in media, and one could argue whether the media investments have even a remotely worker perspective. There's a couple of better sort of approaches that have happened. The one is from NIHAU, the Health and Allied Workers Unions, where they've actually gone through a process of trying to deal with the mandate for the union investment companies and trying to refocus it and support initiatives that are focused on cooperatives and helping members to actually participate in cooperative schemes. NUMSA has adopted a very much one would call a sort of a venture capital sort of approach. So last week, the headlines in some of the business newspapers were that they had reached some deal to distribute COVID medication, but they also have investments, for instance, in the cannabis industry. So I mean, so very much a VC approach, trying to look at greenfield areas that they can invest money in. The number of smaller other investments. MIC, the Mine Workers Investment Company, I think there's a lot of things that they criticize for, but one of the things I think that they do fairly well is that they have a system of transferring funds to members, primarily through through providing bursaries both to members and to members' children, but also through avenues such as the Elijah Bahai training center, which is about building the next generation of union members through training. SACTU, the Clothing and Textile Workers Union, and I think it's a very fascinating case study where they've actually engaged in some engineering of their shareholding in Hoskins Consolidated Investments to actually invest in a company that was going under to stave off retrenchments. It's an interesting case study and one that I'm certainly keen on looking at in the future. But the big overall picture is that these trade union investment companies have been very divisive for union solidarity. There's indicated an institutional weakness both in the structuring of these investment companies, but also an institutional weakness in terms of the strength of the shop floor of workers, because workers have not been able to hold elected leadership of the trade unions accountable in many of these instances. So now I'm going to switch quickly to options. So how do we begin to think about this? Okay, this is a bit of a busy slide. So I've tried to make it easier for you guys to see by using some sort of color coding. So the green parts are around like issues of distribution, the red parts are around issues of redistribution, and the blue parts are kind of linking pre-distribution and redistribution. So this by no means complete. I could add like about 50 different things on here, but I just thought I'd raise a couple of issues that were important. Let's start with redistribution. So I think one of the key things that we need to do is we need to shift away from income-based redistributions to asset-based redistributions, and not only land. So there's a range of ways that one could do it. I mean, students are out in protest basically to get an education. I mean, it's insane that we're still discussing this in this day and age. I mean, if you're good enough to get into a top university in this country, your country needs to support you to get through this process. And yeah, I mean, I'm happy to debate it with anybody. I just believe that, I mean, higher education is one thing we should be heavily investing in. But there's a range of schemes that are available to actually make that sort of investment viable. I mean, one of those might be through creating what are called baby bonds. So when a kid is born, government, together maybe with a co-payment from a parent, would set up an investment for a child, which would mature when they're 18 years old and could use it for education. We also could, I mean, in a very short term, introduce a graduate tax that, I mean, that I think over a period of sort of 10 to 15 years makes the whole institution of NSFAS viable. But basically what it is that you need a stock of value for people at a household level so they're able to craft a strategy for social mobility. We come to this issue around linking pre-distribution and redistribution, because there's no, I mean, I think Kwesi put it quite well about how we link the initiatives around Black economic empowerment to this wider challenge that we have in our society of development, of eradicating our society of poverty and unemployment. And the key thing is about linking economic incentives to job creation initiatives. And I think that's been one of the weaknesses of Black economic empowerment, is that we haven't placed employment at the core of even those Black economic empowerment initiatives, right? And this is crucial because although we argue that we moved away from passive investments to more active investments by Black companies, which I think is broadly true, even there, I think we're doing much better in terms of shifting it towards more labor-absorbing activities. Of course, there's other mechanisms that we need to use between linking these two. Pre-distribution and redistribution, industrial policies, a range of stuff. I mean, it's a seminar. We can't go through all of this here. The last part, which is around pre-distribution, I'm going to start on the top of the slide. Building on something that Kwesi has mentioned earlier, was around renewable energy. And we didn't caucus before this meeting, so I think it's good to see that we're on the same page. But in my engagements around what we should do with pension funds, and I've opposed the approach taken by the unions and to a large extent partners in NEDLEC, where they want to bail out Eskom. And instead, what we could consider, for instance, a society-wide company, where we take 1% of retirement funds and put it into a renewable energy company. That could be held by the retirement funds themselves, or could be held by smaller solar panel installers. I mean, there's a range of ways that you can begin to structure this here, but this does two things. One, it shifts us away from coal, but secondly, it allows an opportunity for Black people to actually participate in what is a greenfield industry at the moment. The second area is around extending support for ESOPs. So without going into the technical details, I mean, the BE scorecard is one avenue to do this here, but I think we need to be incentivizing companies to establish ESOPs. There's a criticism that ESOPs basically is equivalent of a why not just give you the unions another 13th check. However, if you look at some of the successful case studies, and we go through a couple in the chapter. Clicks and Kumba Iron Ore, those are significant amounts of money that are given to workers in those companies that they could use as an investment into a whole range of things. It'll be interesting for someone to research what do actually workers invest once they've received these lump sum payments. In terms of trade union investment companies, without fudging the issues, I mean, I think it's a debate to be won within the unions, and I think long term, we have to start raising issues around defunding these trade union investment companies. Unless we find a way of investment companies coexisting with worker structures. It's absolutely critical if we want to see a longer term role for trade unions and specifically COSATU trade unions in the longer term. The final area that I'd like to highlight is that we need to shift instruments such as stokvels, small businesses towards more productive activities. So there's there's this idea or concept which exists already around business stokvels. It's certainly very interesting to see the combination of cooperation between members on the one hand, and the attainment of profit in a conventional sense on the other hand, and in the third part, the redistribution of that profit to members. And these are professionals largely working in government, but also in business. And it's an interesting area, a new sort of way of developing these initiatives. In terms of small businesses, there is a tension, just as I mentioned, there's a tension between Black economic empowerment and employment. I think there's also a tension between small businesses and Black economic empowerment, simply because we haven't managed to create a viable small business sector which is Black owned. So when you look at the numbers, it says majority Black owned businesses, but when you look at the details, many of these businesses are survivalist. And certainly we need to be using instruments such as procurement to begin to support these small businesses. So as a concluding comment, I think the important thing to note here is that a trade union investment company exists within an environment and in a sense replicates the rent-seeking behavior that's more broadly found within the economy. Beginning to change that into that environment through redistribution, interventions based on assets, but also looking at this idea of pre-distribution in a more serious way, I think provides an opportunity for not only trade union investment companies, but for stokvels, small businesses, other broad-based schemes, cooperatives, to exist and thrive. The third point that I'd like to make is that even though we're arguing for broader sort of structural change to make these types of schemes viable, that does not in any way get the trade unions off the hook. They have some serious issues that they need to deal with. They also own large numbers of assets in many cases. So it's about time that a debate starts within the trade union around how it takes the next steps to actually work out its role within the broader Black economic space. So Ayabonga, I thank you. I think I just managed to stay on time.
No, you ran over for a little bit there.
Okay, apologies.
So maybe we'll make up for that time when you try and respond to some of the questions. But thank you very much, Ike, for that input. And I mean, as you were talking, a few themes emerging, which I'm finding quite interesting. I mean, this idea of the baby bonds, quite an interesting idea worth exploring. I mean, thinking of it as well alongside what Thomas Piketty argues for, which is a universal capital endowment, which he thinks is critical to dealing, I guess, with the global inequality regime. I think the other element is then your comment around the stokvels and channeling that towards productive investment. An interesting development last year was that one of the cooperative financial institutions that were licensed was a group